Today's video is brought to you by Monk Pack, tasty, low-sugar, keto-friendly snack bars. More on them in just a bit. Once upon a time, during the closing days of the Wild West, there was a group of mean and dangerous brothers called the Daltons. And together with their friends, they formed a gang that liked to rob banks and trains, steal horses, and any other illicit activity that might make them some money. Anyone who tried to interfere with their felonious enterprises had a good chance of getting pumped full of lead and ditched by the side of the road. But then, October the 5th, 1892, gang leader Bob Dalton decided that 5 of them would enter the city of Coffeyville, Kansas, and rob 2 banks at once in broad daylight to show the whole world that the Dalton gang was the most feared group of outlaws in the Wild West. But things didn't really go his way, and a massive shootout ensued between the Dalton gang and the people of Coffeyville. When the smoke settled, 8 people were dead, including 4 of the 5 gang members. Bob Dalton was dead, as was his brother Grat, Bill Powers, and Dick Broadwell. Youngest brother, Emmett Dalton, was the only survivor, despite sustaining dozens of wounds. Even so, he was arrested and sentenced to life in prison. And just like that, the Dalton gang was no more. Except that a 4th brother, named Bill Dalton, was still around. On that fateful day, he and another outlaw named Bill Doolin may have been waiting outside the city with fresh horses to help the gang make their escape. Once they found out what had happened to the others, they resolved to form a new group led by the 2 of them. Often they say that the sequel is never as good as the original, but that was not the case here, as the Doolin-Dalton gang became more successful, more notorious, and longer lived than the first incarnation. Eventually, it gained a new name to match its fearsome reputation. It became known as the Wild Bunch. Mason Dalton was born circa 1865 in Cass County, Missouri, to Lewis Dalton and Adeline Younger. The family relocated to Kansas, where Mason and his 14 siblings grew up. Later in life, he started going by William Bill Dalton, so we're just going to call him that from the beginning to make it a whole lot less confusing. There are already enough Daltons going around in this video to use one with 2 names. His mother was related to the Younger brothers, who were part of the notorious James Younger gang alongside Frank and Jesse James. The gang predated the Wild Bunch by a couple of decades, so Bill Dalton and his brothers grew up hearing of their uncle's daring and violent exploits. Even so, for a while it seemed like the Dalton boys were destined to walk on the right side of the law. The family's pride and joy was Frank Dalton. In 1884, he became a deputy U.S. Marshal for the Oklahoma Territory and was considered by his peers to be a brave and respected lawman. However, he was gunned down in 1887 while attempting to arrest a horse thief. At first, the other Dalton brothers thought they could pick up the mantle left behind by big brother Frank. Grat Dalton took over his job as deputy marshal and then hired Bob and Emmett to serve as guards. But it became pretty obvious soon enough that they weren't meant to walk the straight and narrow. It started with too much drinking and too much gambling on the job. Then there were the incidents when the brothers got a bit too trigger happy, and it ended with plain old corruption, as the boys sought to supplement their meager salaries by abusing their authority. Sometimes they would fine a person instead of arresting them. Other times they would confiscate illegal goods, but every time the cash and cargo seemed to mysteriously vanish before reaching the sheriff's station. Ultimately, the brothers said, "Screw it," and they started their gang. As far as Bill Dalton was concerned, he too tried to live an honest life at first. He started out working various odd jobs with his brothers before moving to Livingston, California, where he was employed by a rancher named Cyrus Bliven. Soon after, Bill fell in love with the rancher's daughter, Jenny Bliven. The two got married in 1885 and had 2 children together, Charles and Grace. It really seemed like Bill Dalton had his life together. He started a family, he bought his own ranch, he opened a business, and even got involved in local politics. The people who knew him described him as charming, good-looking, and the life of the party. So what exactly possessed him to turn to a life of crime? It seems that his brothers had a negative influence on Bill. Bob and Grat and Emmett sometimes showed up at Bill's ranch for a visit when they were looking to lay low from the authorities. It is possible that the brothers committed several robberies in the late 1880s and early 1890s and used Bill's ranch as a hideout, but it is uncertain if Bill ever joined them in any of their ventures. He finally showed up on the sheriff's radar in 1891 when somebody committed a train robbery in the town of Alila, California, which involved the murder of a locomotive fireman named George Radcliffe. Bob and Emmett Dalton were wanted for the crime. They managed to flee to California, but Bill and Grat Dalton were arrested for helping them escape. Even though all charges against Bill were eventually dropped, his reputation was tarnished forever, and he was considered to be just another no-good Dalton boy. At this point, there was no use in pretending anymore, so Bill accepted his new role in life as an outlaw, although we're not really sure to what extent he participated in the illicit activities of the Dalton gang. Who knows? After the Coffeyville massacre, with his brothers dead or in jail, Bill may have been tempted to return to ranching if it wasn't for another man. We arrive at the second namesake of the Doolin-Dalton gang, William Doolin, born circa 1858 on a homestead northeast of Clarksville, Arkansas. His parents were Michael Doolin and Artemina Bella, a pair of law-abiding sharecroppers. Bill worked on the family farm until 1881, at which point the 23-year-old left the homestead to find his own way in life. Like Bill Dalton, he didn't seem to be particularly inclined toward a life of crime, which makes it all the more curious that they ended up leading one of the most notorious gangs of the Wild West. In the Oklahoma Territory, Doolin found work as a cowboy on the ranch of a Texan named Oscar Halsell, who liked Bill enough to take him under his wing and teach him to read and write. This was Doolin's life for the next 10 years, drifting from one ranch to another, filling whatever position was needed. We know that during this time he met some of the men who would later form part of his gang, but we're not sure exactly what prompted Bill to turn to robbery. By 1891, however, he was a member of the Dalton gang and became an outlaw following a shootout in Coffeyville, Kansas. Strangely enough, this isn't the aforementioned bloody gunfight that got the two Dalton brothers killed and ended the gang. This happened a year earlier when Doolin and a few cohorts wanted to celebrate the 4th of July with a keg of beer. But Kansas was a dry state at the time, and the local lawmen didn't take kindly to drunkards around there. Except that Doolin and his friends didn't take kindly to local lawmen trying to confiscate their hooch, so both sides started shooting at each other, resulting in 2 injuries and a life on the run for Bill Doolin. Doolin had a somewhat contentious relationship with the Dalton brothers, particularly Bob Dalton, who often acted as the leader of the group. Some sources claim that Doolin briefly left the gang alongside 2 other members named Charlie Pierce and George Bitter Creek Newcomb, who are worth mentioning as they would later be a part of the Wild Bunch. All 3 of them were angry with the Daltons because they felt Bob wasn't quite equitable when it came to divvying up the loot. It seems this was one of those situations where everyone was equal, but some were more equal than the others, and some of the core members of the Dalton gang received bigger shares than the rest. Ultimately, this worked out in Doolin's favor. After all, if he were one of Bob Dalton's trusty sidekicks, then he probably would have been present in Coffeyville on the day of the gunfight and ended up in a cheap pine box right next to Bob and the others. But as things stood, after October 5th, 1892, Bill Doolin was now an independent gunman, ready to strike out on his own. Alright, we'll get back to our video in just a second, but first, here's a word from today's fantastic sponsor, Munk Pack. Munk Pack offers low-sugar, keto-friendly bars which are plant-based, gluten-free, and non-GMO. They're the perfect snack for anyone who's trying to eat better or cut back on sugar and carbs without sacrificing taste. Munk Pack keto granola bars and nut and seed bars. This is nut and seed. This is one of their granola bars. They contain 1 gram of sugar or less, 2 to 3 grams of net carbs, and each bar contains 150 calories or less. Look, everyone snacks. For me, when I get home from work, there's probably some crisps in the cupboard that my wife has bought, and I'll be like, yeah, let's snack on those because they're tasty. But since having Munk Pack in my cupboard, I just grab one of these, and it is tasty, it is delicious. This is probably my favorite, the caramel sea salt flavor. I just like the salty and sugary goodness. I just love that. And I just eat one of these instead. It satiates that after work hunger, and I don't end up eating crisps, which I know are horribly bad for me. Munk Pack have a great chewy texture, and they come in delicious flavors like sea salt dark chocolate, the one I mentioned, coconut, cocoa chip, and caramel sea salt. They're perfect for a quick breakfast, a snack between Zoom calls, or as a guilt-free, decadent dessert. Tasty stuff. You guys can get 20% off. Finish my mouthful. 20% off your first purchase of any Munk Pack product by visiting monkpack.com and entering my code Biographics at checkout. And Munk Pack is so confident in their products, it's backed with a 100% happiness guarantee. So if you don't like it for any reason, they'll exchange the product or refund your money, whichever you prefer. And now back to today's video. After the bloody shootout at Coffeyville, Doolin, Newcomb, and Pierce felt obligated to visit the Dalton household and pay their respects to the family matriarch, who had just buried 2 sons and saw another imprisoned for life. While there, they met up with Bill Dalton, and Doolin floated the idea of the 4 of them starting a new gang and picking up right where things left off. Bill accepted, and the Doolin-Dalton gang was born. Truth be told, Bill Doolin was the de facto leader of the group. Bill Dalton didn't really have the credentials to lead a gang, but they probably added him in honor of his brothers and for brand recognition, since the Dalton name was already known and feared throughout the West. Of course, 4 men might make a nice barbershop quartet, but they are not enough for a dangerous gang, so the first thing they did was to draft a few more names to their roster. We're not going to go through all of them, just know that 11 men were part of the Wild Bunch at one point or another. They all had colourful names like William Tulsa Jack Blake and Dan Dynamite Dick Clifton, and they all ultimately met their ends in violent shootouts, so, well, expect a lot of gunfights in the very near future. In fact, let's start right now. We believe that the first crime committed by the new and improved gang was the robbery of the Ford County Bank in Spearville, Kansas on November 1st, 1892. Following their escape, the authorities identified one of the gunmen as Oliver Olyantis and put the marshals on his trail. They tracked down Yantis at his sister's ranch on the 29th of November and gunned him down when the outlaw refused to surrender. Yantis died of his wounds the next day, becoming the first member of the Wild Bunch to go out in a hail of bullets just a month after the gang was formed. The rest of the outlaws were more successful and spent the first half of 1893 robbing multiple trains and banks without too much hassle. But on September the 1st, they took part in one event remembered in Western lore as one of its fiercest gunfights and solidified their reputation as the Wild Bunch. It became known as the Battle of Ingalls, named after the town of Ingalls, Oklahoma, which the criminals sometimes used as a hideout. As we mentioned, by that point, the gang had plenty of successful robberies under its belt, so it was firmly on the radar of the US Marshals, who vowed to risk life and limb in order to bring the Wild Bunch to justice. On September 1st, 1893, a posse of over a dozen marshals, led by John Nixon, tracked the outlaws to Ingalls. Most of the gang members had been there for weeks, drinking, gambling, and most importantly, spending money, which is why the locals looked the other way when it came to how they obtained their ill-gotten gains. As the marshals rode into town, all of the criminals were playing cards in the saloon, except for Roy Dougherty, aka Arkansas Tom Jones, who was sick in bed in his room of the OK Hotel. As George Newcomb exited the saloon, the marshals opened fire, prompting all of the outlaws to abandon their poker game and respond in kind. Within seconds, the tiny town of Ingalls transformed into a war zone covered in smoke, with bullets flying in every direction. Hearing the commotion outside, Arkansas Tom Jones went to the window of his hotel room and opened fire on the lawman, mortally wounding Deputy Marshal Tom Houston. The surprise attack allowed some of the other outlaws to make their way to the stable and retrieve their horses. They charged out of the livery with their guns blazing and killed 2 more marshals, Lafayette Shadley and Dick Speed, as well as an innocent bystander who got caught in the crossfire. With the lawman on the defensive, the Wild Bunch was able to ride out of town with only a few minor injuries to show for their troubles. There was still the little matter of Arkansas Tom Jones, who was trapped inside his hotel room. Given that they had just lost 3 of their own, the marshals were in no mood to negotiate, so they gave Jones 2 options: surrender, or they'd throw dynamite in his room. Jones surrendered, was arrested, and later convicted to 50 years in prison, although he was released after serving less than 20. Strangely enough, getting caught prolonged his life substantially, as he outlived all of his compatriots by 2 to 3 decades. However, during the 1920s, Jones started robbing banks again, and in 1924 he was finally killed in a gunfight in Joplin, Missouri, as the last of the Wild Bunch. After making an escape from Ingalls, the rest of the gang decided to lay low for the rest of the year, but in 1894 they were back to their old shenanigans, and by shenanigans we of course mean robbery, violence, and the occasional murder. A stagecoach in Arkansas, a train in Oklahoma, a bank in Kansas. Little by little, the Wild Bunch were becoming the biggest terror in the West. But it was their little stunt in Ingalls that made them public enemies #1 in the eyes of the marshals. Undoubtedly, there were more than a few lawmen who would have loved to catch the gang members in their crosshairs. The officers doggedly pursued the Wild Bunch from state to state, led by a famed trio of marshals named Bill Tillman, Heck Thomas, and Chris Madsen, who were collectively known as the 3 Guardsmen. And who knows, maybe one day we'll cover them on Biographics as well. Anyway, having the law constantly on their trail didn't seem to deter the Wild Bunch, as the gang committed one brazen act after another, including a daring raid on Southwest City, Missouri, which saw the Wild Bunch successfully ride out of town following a bank robbery, despite the fact that marshals and townspeople fired at them from both sides of the street as the gang was making its getaway. It was another successful score that left the gang unscathed and almost $4,000 richer. It really seemed like the Wild Bunch had more than a few rabbit's feet tucked away somewhere in their saddles, the way they kept avoiding any serious injuries. But their luck was about to run out, and it started with none other than Bill Dalton. On June the 8th, 1894, Dalton was lying low at his home in Ardmore, Oklahoma, when a posse of armed lawmen surrounded the house. If Bill would have exited his home, hands held high in the air, he might have survived. But that's not how things played out. Instead, he jumped out the window, gun in hand, and started running towards the posse. It was one final act of defiance from a man who decided to go out on his own terms As you might imagine, he was immediately ripped to shreds by the hail of gunfire. The final Dalton had been dealt with, marking an end to one of the most feared names to come out of the Old West. His wife, who stuck by his side and raised the kids while he was out with the rest of the Wild Bunch, identified his body and had it shipped to California to be buried. For the rest of the gang, even with Dalton's death, it was business as usual, since it was unlikely that any of them expected to make it to old age anyway. Even so, the rest of the year was pretty quiet, with no other notable events occurring in 1894. 1895, however, was a completely different story, as all the other Wild Bunch members started getting picked off one by one. First off, Tulsa Jack Blake. On April 3rd, 1895, 5 members of the gang had just robbed another train near Rock Island, Oklahoma, and made camp for the night in a basin along the Cimarron River. Unbeknownst to him, a posse of U.S. Marshals sniffed out their trail and approached their camp in the dead of night. The lawman called for the outlaws to surrender, but of course, this was never going to happen. Another wild shootout erupted, and roughly 200 shots later, the gunsmoke cleared. Blake lay dead while the rest of the bandits managed to make their escape. Just a month later, the Wild Bunch lost 2 of its founding members, George Bittercreek Newcomb and Charlie Pierce. On May the 2nd, the 2 of them traveled to the Dunn Ranch in Payne County, Oklahoma. Newcomb wanted to visit his lover, a woman named Rose Dunn, pretty famous in her own right, but better known as Rose of Cimarron. The gang were also on friendly terms with their brothers, who they knew from Ingalls, so Newcomb and Pierce felt pretty safe as they approached the ranch. What they didn't know is that the Dunn brothers preferred money over friendship, and they intended to collect on the large bounties placed on all members of the Wild Bunch. To them, Newcomb and Pierce showing up at their home was like a turkey basting and stuffing itself and then jumping into the oven on its own volition. The temptation was just too great. So, as the 2 unsuspecting outlaws got off their horses, they were ambushed and gunned down, and the Dunn brothers became several $1,000s richer. 4 months later, another member of the gang named Little Bill Raidler was shot and injured by one of the 3 guardsmen and taken in alive. He was sent to jail for 10 years, but released in 1903 due to health issues, and he died a year later. Therefore, Raidler became the only member of the Wild Bunch not to be killed directly in a gunfight, even though his death came as a result of the injuries that he sustained in his shootout with the Marshals. By 1896, half of the gang was gone, and the other half had split up, hoping to evade the authorities as long as possible. George Redbuck Waitman was killed in another gunfight with the Marshals on March 4th, 1896, while Dynamite Dick Clifton and Little Dick West were gunned down in 1897 and 1898 respectively. We're left with just one man, Bill Doolin, the leader of the Wild Bunch. In June 1896, Guardsman Bill Tillman captured him without incident at Eureka Springs, Arkansas, and sent him to federal prison in Guthrie, Oklahoma to await trial. As it happened, Clifton was also imprisoned there, so the 2 of them and a dozen other inmates executed a prison break on July 5th. Doolin ran away to his father-in-law's farm in Lawson, Oklahoma, to be with his wife and son. Perhaps he realized that it was the end of the road for him, so he wanted one more chance to see his family. Unsurprisingly, marshals soon tracked him down to the homestead, and on August 25th, 1896, they trapped Doolin in an ambush. Like Dalton, he could have surrendered, but he preferred to go out shooting, so Doolin raised his gun and aimed it at the marshals, but didn't get a chance to pull the trigger before one of the deputies emptied a double-barreled shotgun straight into his chest. And then there were none. 11 violent deaths for 11 violent men meant the end of the most ruthless gang that the Old West had ever seen, the gang known as the Wild Bunch. Hope you found today's video interesting. If you did, please do hit that like button below. Don't forget to subscribe, and thank you for watching.